The evening at Le Grand Restaurant was nothing out of the ordinary, or so the staff thought. The rich, the famous, and the powerful filled the room, their laughter echoing off the gold-framed mirrors and crystal chandeliers. But tonight, an unsuspecting waitress named Maria would unknowingly become the center of a cruel millionaire's twisted game. At the grand table, nestled between towering candles and expensive wine glasses, sat a man whose wealth matched his arrogance. His name was Victor Delacroix, a businessman whose empire was built on exploiting others. To him, people were simply tools to get ahead, nothing more than servants, to be used at his discretion. And for some strange reason, he took great pleasure in embarrassing them. As the evening progressed, Victor's eyes fell on Maria, the young waitress quietly making her rounds. Her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, her uniform pristine, she worked tirelessly with a smile, doing her best to make the customers feel welcome. She had no idea that her life was about to change forever. Victor's sharp voice cut through the chatter of the room. "You, waitress. Come here." Maria froze, her heart pounding. She had seen him before, of course, a regular customer who'd never been particularly kind. His gaze was piercing, and his words always laced with condescension. But tonight, something was different. "Do you play the violin?" Victor's voice dripped with mockery, and the room fell silent. Maria stood there, confused. She didn't know how to respond. I am not sure what you mean, sir." "Play me a tune," Victor ordered, leaning back in his chair. "Let's see if the talent of a mere waitress can impress me." The guests around the table chuckled, waiting for her to make a fool of herself. But what they didn't know was that Maria had a secret, one she had kept hidden for years. For just a moment, Maria stood there, her palms sweaty, her knees trembling. And then, something inside her shifted. Her hands moved almost on their own, and she found herself nodding. "I'll play." With a few quiet steps, Maria made her way to the small stage in the corner, her heart racing. She'd played the violin since childhood, but no one had ever heard her. Her music had always been for herself, for the quiet moments in her room, away from prying eyes. But tonight, she was going to show the world what she was capable of. Little did anyone know, Maria's talent was about to turn the tables on the man who thought he could break her. Victor Delacroix was no stranger to power. With a net worth that could rival some small countries, his name was synonymous with wealth, success, and most importantly, control. He had built his empire from the ground up, a ruthless businessman whose every move was calculated for maximum gain. Le Grand Restaurant was just another stop in his busy life, but it was one that allowed him to indulge in his favorite pastime, belittling those beneath him. Victor was notorious for treating servers, waiters, and anyone in the service industry like they were less than human. To him, they were nothing more than tools to carry out his needs, and he had no qualms about reminding them of their place. His money gave him the power to do whatever he pleased, and he relished in it. Maria had worked at Le Grand for 2 years, her dark eyes always searching for the next task, her movements graceful yet quick, as if anticipating the needs of her customers before they even voiced them. Her job was a far cry from the dreams she had once held for herself, dreams of becoming a renowned violinist, traveling the world, performing for audiences who would marvel at her talent. But life had a way of shifting priorities. When her mother fell ill and her father lost his job, Maria had put her dreams on hold. She found herself in a small, cramped apartment, scraping by on tips and working long hours just to make ends meet. She loved her family and would do anything for them, but the life she had imagined seemed to drift further away with each passing day. Victor noticed Maria the first time she served him. She was quiet, polite, and efficient. But there was something about her that made him take a second glance. Perhaps it was the way she moved, graceful and purposeful, almost as if she belonged to another world, one that didn't involve the mundane task of serving food. Or maybe it was her eyes, dark and focused, hiding a depth that intrigued him. Whatever it was, Victor found himself watching her more than he should have. Maria had learned to endure the sharp words of wealthy patrons, their cruel comments that cut deeper than any knife could. She had learned to smile through the insults, to carry herself with dignity even when everything inside her screamed to lash out. She couldn't afford to lose this job, and she couldn't afford to give in to the humiliation. She had been through too much to let anyone, especially someone like Victor, break her. Victor, however, did not share the same restraint. He enjoyed the power he held over others, the way people cowered before him, unable to speak up for fear of losing their livelihoods. He had been coming to Le Grand for months, each time finding new ways to make his presence felt. Whether it was a sarcastic comment about the food or an overtly rude remark to the staff, he took great pleasure in watching people squirm. It was on this particular evening, as he settled into his usual corner booth, that he decided to make Maria his target. She approached his table with her usual poise, setting down the menu with a soft smile. "Good evening, Mr. Delacroix. What can I get for you tonight?" Victor's lips curled into a smile that never quite reached his cold eyes. "A glass of your finest red wine," he said with a flourish. "And while you're at it, play me a song. Can you play the violin?" Maria froze for just a second, caught off guard by the suddenness of his request. It wasn't uncommon for Victor to make strange demands, but this was different. Her heart raced, and she felt the familiar knot in her stomach. I'm afraid I don't," she began, but Victor waved her off dismissively. "Come on," he said, his voice mocking. "You must have some talent. I've heard waitresses are good for more than just serving food. Or are you all just trained to be mute servants?" The other guests at the table laughed, their chuckles filled with the kind of cruelty only the wealthy could get away with. Maria's face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and anger, but she held her ground. "I'm just here to serve, sir," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, but it quivered slightly. "Oh, I'm sure you are," Victor replied, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But surely, you can entertain me for a few minutes. It's not much to ask for, is it? Just a song." Maria's mind raced. She had played the violin since she was a child, and her talent had always been something she kept to herself. She wasn't sure why she hadn't pursued her dreams, but she knew that playing in front of a group of wealthy strangers, especially for someone like Victor, was terrifying. She wanted to refuse, to walk away, but something in her held her back. The guests around the table continued to watch, their eyes gleaming with amusement. Some were ready to witness her failure, others were eager to see her humiliation. It was a game to them, an entertainment that cost them nothing. Victor, however, sat back, a smirk on his face. He enjoyed the power he had over her. To him, Maria was nothing more than a puppet, one whose strings he could pull at will. Maria swallowed hard. She had two choices: stay silent and endure, or do something she had never done before, reclaim her dignity, if only for a moment. The room seemed to grow quieter, and all eyes were on her. Her breath caught in her throat, but then she did something she hadn't planned. She nodded. "I'll play," she said softly, her voice steadying. "I'll play." The guests gasped, surprised by her response. They had expected her to cower, to beg for forgiveness. Instead, she had agreed. Maria didn't know why she had agreed, but as she turned to walk toward the small stage in the corner of the room, something inside her shifted. She wasn't just going to play for them, she was going to show them something they'd never forget. Victor's smirk widened, thinking he had won. Little did he know, this was the moment that would change everything. The room was silent as Maria stepped onto the small stage in the corner of the restaurant, the soft glow of the dim lights casting a gentle halo around her. All eyes were on her now, some in expectation, some in mockery, and others out of sheer curiosity. The guests had been waiting for her to make a fool of herself, to stumble through a tune that would prove how out of place she was in a setting like this. But Maria wasn't thinking about them. She wasn't thinking about anything except the violin she had tucked under her chin, the bow in her hand. For a brief moment, Maria closed her eyes. The soft hum of the restaurant faded away, and she allowed herself to be transported back to a time when playing the violin was a source of joy rather than humiliation. She had played since she was a child, her fingers dancing across the strings, producing melodies that spoke to her soul. Music had always been her escape, her sanctuary. But now, it was her weapon. She took a deep breath and began to play. The first note was hesitant, but it was enough to silence the room. The guests who had been laughing, waiting for her to fail, fell into a stunned silence. Victor, who had expected a clumsy attempt, was taken aback. The sound that filled the room was unlike anything they had imagined. Maria's fingers moved with grace and precision, each note resonating with an unexpected depth and beauty. She wasn't just playing a song, she was telling a story, one that spoke of longing, loss, and resilience. The melody she played was a classical piece, a composition she had learned years ago, but it felt as if the music was coming from somewhere deep inside her. It wasn't the same violin piece that people typically heard in concert halls, played by polished professionals. No, this was something more raw, more genuine. The music came from a place inside her that had never been tapped, a place that had been hidden away for far too long. The longer Maria played, the more the guests began to shift in their seats. They couldn't help it. They had come to see a waitress make a fool of herself, to laugh at her discomfort. But now, they were watching something entirely different. Something real. Something that demanded their attention. Victor, whose smirk had been wide and confident just moments before, now found himself at a loss for words. Maria's talent was undeniable. She had kept it hidden for so long, too afraid of rejection, too afraid of being dismissed as just another girl from a working-class background. But now, here, in front of a room full of people who had once seen her as nothing more than a servant, she was showing them something they could never have imagined. She was showing them who she really was. Victor leaned forward in his seat, his eyes narrowing. He had never expected this. Never expected a simple waitress, someone he had never bothered to look at twice, to possess such incredible skill. It unnerved him. It made him feel small. And he didn't like it. The guests around the table were no longer laughing. Instead, they were listening intently, absorbed by the unexpected beauty of Maria's performance. Some even closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. They could no longer see her as just a waitress. She had become something more, a true artist, her soul laid bare through the violin strings. But not everyone was moved. Some guests still looked at Maria with disdain, as though they couldn't quite reconcile the woman they had just seen serving their drinks with the woman playing the violin in front of them. One older man, sitting at the back of the room, muttered under his breath, "This is just a trick. She's probably playing some cheap tune." Victor didn't respond. His mind was racing. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't how the night was supposed to go. He had made her play for his amusement, to reinforce his superiority, to remind her of her place. But now, he wasn't sure if he had made a mistake. The music was too powerful, too beautiful to be dismissed so easily. The guests were captivated. They weren't just hearing the music, they were feeling it. The emotions Maria conveyed through each note were palpable, and for the first time that evening, Victor's arrogance began to crumble. Maria's fingers flew across the violin's strings, each movement fluid and precise. The room had become a canvas, and her music was the paint. She wasn't playing for Victor anymore, or for the guests. She was playing for herself. She was playing for the part of her that had been silenced for too long, the part of her that dreamed of performing on grand stages, of being recognized not for her job, but for her talent. And as she played, something inside her shifted. She felt powerful, free. It was as though the weight of the world had been lifted off her shoulders. She wasn't just a waitress in a fancy restaurant. She was an artist, a musician, someone worthy of respect, regardless of her circumstances. The music, her music, became her declaration of independence. Victor's expression shifted from surprise to frustration. He had always been the one in control, the one who called the shots. But now, watching Maria play with such raw emotion, he felt like a bystander in his own restaurant. His sense of superiority, which had been his armor for so long, was beginning to crack. The woman he had tried to humiliate had turned the tables on him. And he didn't know how to handle it. Maria played the final note of the piece, her bow gliding smoothly across the strings. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the world had stopped, just to acknowledge the brilliance of what they had just witnessed. Then, slowly, the applause began. It started with a few claps, hesitant and unsure, but as more people joined in, the room erupted into a standing ovation. Maria stood there, breathless, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to be met with admiration, with respect. But as she looked around the room, she realized that she had earned it. Not because she had been forced into performing, but because she had shown everyone her true self, the part of her that had always been hidden away. Victor sat back in his chair, his face a mixture of disbelief and anger. He didn't know how to react. He wanted to dismiss it, to pretend like it hadn't happened, but the applause around him was impossible to ignore. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had lost control. And it terrified him. Maria walked off the stage, her heart still racing, but now with a sense of pride. She had done it. She had shown them all who she truly was. And for the first time in a long time, she felt seen. The applause still echoed in her ears as she made her way back to the kitchen, but it wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the fact that, in that moment, she had taken back her dignity. She had taken back her voice. The applause filled the room, but Maria hardly heard it. Her heart raced, a whirlwind of emotions clouding her mind. The last few moments felt like a blur, a strange mix of triumph and disbelief. She had played her heart out, and for once, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't just a waitress. She was someone. But as she made her way back to the kitchen, a cold, unsettling feeling crept over her. Victor Delacroix, the man who had orchestrated her humiliation, was staring at her, his face a mask of frustration and disbelief. For the first time in years, Maria saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something that wasn't disdain or mockery. But whatever it was, it made her uneasy. Victor couldn't let this stand. He had been the one in control. He was the one who had forced her to perform for his amusement, and now she had completely turned the tables on him. The applause, the admiration from the guests, it had unsettled him in a way he wasn't ready to admit. This wasn't how the night was supposed to go. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor, silencing the room for a brief moment. His voice rang out across the restaurant, cutting through the whispers of the guests. "Enough," he said, his voice sharp. "That's enough." Maria froze in place, the weight of his words pressing down on her. Her mind raced, but she didn't speak. She couldn't. The words felt like they were stuck in her throat, lodged there by something far more powerful than fear. Victor's gaze never left her. He looked at her as if she were a mere object, something to be used, and now, something that had defied him. His eyes narrowed, the flicker of doubt that had once crossed his face replaced by an unmistakable wave of anger. "You think you can impress me?" he said, his voice dripping with disdain once again. "A little violin performance doesn't change who you are, or what you are." The words cut through the tension like a knife. For a moment, it felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. The guests who had been so moved by her music now exchanged uncertain glances. They hadn't expected this sudden shift. Some of them began to look uncomfortable, realizing that what had started as a light-hearted performance was now becoming something darker, something they didn't know how to handle. Maria felt her blood run cold, but she held her ground. She had already proven herself in that moment. The music had spoken for her when words failed. She wasn't just a servant. She was someone, and no matter how hard Victor tried, he couldn't take that away from her. Victor stepped closer, the air thick with tension. He had to regain control, to make sure that everyone knew who was truly in charge. The applause had unsettled him, yes, but he was a man of power. He didn't lose control. And Maria had made him feel like he wasn't in control anymore. He pulled out a wad of cash from his pocket and threw it onto the table in front of her, his actions deliberate and forceful. The money fluttered to the floor, landing with a soft thud. "Here," he sneered. "Take your money. But don't ever forget your place." Maria's eyes flicked to the money, then back up to Victor's face. His expression was one of cruel satisfaction, as if he thought this would break her, would make her feel small, insignificant. He was wrong. She could feel the anger bubbling up inside her, threatening to spill over. But this time, she didn't shrink back. This time, she stood tall, her shoulders squared, her back straight. Victor's eyes widened slightly, taken aback by the strength in her gaze. "What's the matter?" he asked, his tone mocking. "Not interested in a tip?" Maria's voice was steady, unwavering as she spoke. "I don't need your money," she said, her words slicing through the air with quiet determination. "What I need is for you to realize that I am not just here to serve you. I am a person. I have value. And I will not be treated like an object." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. Victor's face twisted in anger. His sense of superiority, the thing that had always protected him, was slipping away, piece by piece. The applause had shaken him, and now Maria's words were cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. "Don't talk to me like that," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. Maria didn't flinch. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had nothing left to lose. The humiliation she had feared, the fear of being nothing more than a servant, had been shattered the moment she picked up that violin. She was done being invisible. Victor's fists clenched, but he didn't move. For the first time in his life, someone had stood up to him, and it stung. His anger surged, but deep down, he knew he had crossed a line. He had tried to reduce her to nothing more than a joke, but in doing so, he had underestimated her. And in that moment, Maria had shown him exactly who she was. Victor stood there, silent for a long moment, staring at Maria as though she were a puzzle he couldn't solve. She had taken the power from him, and there was nothing he could do to get it back. Finally, he straightened up, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "You think you're better than me?" he spat. Maria didn't answer him. She didn't need to. She had already said everything that needed to be said with her music and with her words. Victor's expression faltered, his pride taking a blow he couldn't recover from. "You're nothing," he muttered under his breath. But Maria heard him. And this time, she didn't care. Because for the first time, she knew who she was. She knew her worth, and no one, not Victor, not anyone, could take that from her. With one last look at Victor, Maria turned and walked away, her head held high. The guests in the room fell silent, watching her leave. Some of them felt the weight of what had just transpired. Others, like Victor, would try to forget it. But Maria knew that she had won. She had taken control of her own destiny, and no one could take that from her. Maria's steps echoed softly as she walked toward the kitchen, her heart still racing with the adrenaline of her defiance. The applause still lingered in the air, but it no longer mattered. She had said what needed to be said, and in doing so, she had reclaimed her dignity. For the first time, she felt like she was truly herself, no longer a servant, no longer someone's joke. She had stood up for her worth, and that, in itself, was enough. But as Maria passed through the kitchen door, she couldn't help but feel a weight settle in her chest. It wasn't just the high from standing up to Victor, it was the realization that, for all the applause, for all the admiration, things might not change overnight. Would she still be seen as the waitress at Le Grand, the one who served drinks and took orders? Would the guests who had clapped for her still treat her with respect tomorrow? Or would Victor, the man who tried to belittle her, still hold the power in this place? Her thoughts were interrupted when she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to see one of the regular patrons, Mr. Lawson, a businessman who often dined at the restaurant, approaching her. His usual aloof demeanor was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like admiration. "Maria," he said, his voice calm but sincere. "I just wanted to say, that was incredible." Maria's heart skipped a beat. She had not expected this from someone like him. Mr. Lawson was known for his stiff upper lip and his tendency to dismiss the staff as though they were beneath him. But now, standing before her, he was looking at her with a different kind of respect. "You were amazing out there," he continued. "Victor might have tried to make a fool of you, but you showed him, and all of us, something real. I've never heard a performance like that." Maria blinked in surprise. This wasn't just a compliment, it was a moment of recognition. For the first time, someone had seen her not for her job, not for her position in society, but for her talent. And it wasn't just anyone, it was someone who had once been part of the system that had kept people like her down. "Thank you," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I didn't do it for anyone but myself. But, thank you for saying that." Mr. Lawson nodded, his expression serious. "You deserve more than this place, Maria. You should be out there, performing. You should be doing what you love." Maria's breath caught in her throat. Could it be possible? Could someone like her really be more than a waitress in this world? Her mind raced with the possibilities, but she knew she couldn't let herself get lost in dreams. Not yet. She had a family to care for, and she couldn't afford to think of herself as anything but the provider. But then Mr. Lawson spoke again, his voice lower now, almost as if he were sharing a secret. "I know a few people who can help you get where you belong," he said. "I don't know what your plans are, but if you're serious about making something of yourself, I can make a call. You have real talent, Maria. Don't let this be the end of it." For a moment, Maria couldn't believe what she was hearing. A part of her wanted to dismiss it as a fluke, as just another kind gesture from someone who didn't know how hard things were for her. But then she looked into Mr. Lawson's eyes that were no longer looking down on her, but looking at her as an equal, and she knew he wasn't just being polite. He meant it. "You would do that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Lawson smiled, the hardness in his expression softening. "I'd do more than that. You've earned it." Maria's heart swelled. She had never imagined that something like this could happen, not in a million years. The applause from the restaurant had been one thing, but this was something more. This was a chance. A chance to show the world that she was more than just the girl who served food. She was an artist. She had a voice, and for once, someone had heard it. Later that night, after her shift ended, Maria walked out of Le Grand Restaurant, the cool night air brushing against her face. She had no idea what the future held, but for the first time, she felt the spark of possibility in her chest. The world was full of opportunities, and she was finally ready to seize them. Victor Delacroix had tried to humiliate her, to use his wealth and influence to make her feel small. But in the end, it was he who had been exposed for who he truly was, a man who used his power to put others down, a man who could never understand the value of what he had just witnessed. Maria had shown him that there were things more valuable than money, things like dignity, talent, and the courage to stand up for oneself. As Maria walked away from the restaurant, she felt lighter than she had in years. She didn't need Victor's approval. She didn't need anyone's approval. She had her own. And that was more than enough. As Maria stepped out into the cool night, the weight of the evening's events slowly began to settle within her. For years, she had been invisible, just another face in the crowd, just another person working to survive. But tonight, in front of a room full of people, she had stood tall. She had shown them who she was, not just a waitress, but the woman with a voice, a talent, and a strength that couldn't be ignored. Victor Delacroix had tried to break her, to reduce her to nothing more than an object for his amusement. But in doing so, he had only shown his own weakness. Maria had taken control of her story, and in doing so, she had taken control of her life. The applause had been powerful, but the real victory was in what came next, the realization that Maria no longer needed anyone's approval. She had found her own strength, her own worth. And as she walked away from Le Grand Restaurant, the future seemed wide open, filled with endless possibilities. For the first time in her life, Maria was free. Free from the chains of self-doubt, free from the fear of being unnoticed. She was an artist, a woman who had found her voice, and no one could ever take that away from her. If you've ever felt like you're not enough, like the world is telling you that you don't matter, Maria's story is a reminder that your worth is not determined by others. It's defined by you, by the strength you have within yourself to rise above the challenges and show the world what you're truly capable of. If you've been inspired by Maria's courage, share this story with someone who might need to hear it. And remember, no matter what life throws at you, you have the power to change your narrative. You are not defined by your circumstances. You are defined by what you choose to become. If you enjoyed this video and want more stories of triumph over adversity, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Turn on notifications so you never miss an uplifting, life-changing story like Maria's. Your journey of self-discovery and empowerment is just beginning. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.